Walk into the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, Norway, and you'll see something that shouldn't exist. The Oseberg ship, built in the year 820 AD, over 1,100 years old. And it's still here. The wood is intact, the craftsmanship visible. You can see the exact axe marks from the builder who shaped each plank. Now compare that to your neighbour's fishing boat, built in 1985. 40 years old. The hull is covered in blisters. The fiberglass is soft when you press on it. Water is trapped inside the walls. The boat is rotting from the inside out, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. A wooden ship built with hand tools in the 9th century has outlasted a maintenance-free fiberglass boat, built with modern chemistry by over 1,000 years. What did Viking shipbuilders know that we forgot? The answer isn't just about better wood or lucky burial, it's a completely different philosophy. Today we're revealing what's killing your modern boat and what kept Viking ships sailing for decades. Let's start with the 2 lies you were sold. In 1947, a company called Winner Manufacturing launched the Plasticraft line, the first mass-produced fiberglass boats in America. The marketing was aggressive. They fired .38 caliber bullets at the hulls to prove they were bulletproof. They dropped boats from helicopters. The message was clear. Fiberglass is indestructible. By the 1960s, every boat manufacturer was making the same promise. Maintenance-free, rot-proof, built to last a lifetime. Wooden boats required constant care. You had to caulk the seams, sand and paint every year and check for rot. It was endless work. Fiberglass promised to end all of that. Just buy the boat, use it and forget about it. Except fiberglass isn't maintenance-free. It's maintenance invisible. The problems are happening inside the hull where you can't see them. And by the time you notice, the damage is catastrophic. Here's what's actually happening inside your indestructible boat. Fiberglass is made from 2 materials: glass fibers for strength and polyester resin, a type of plastic that holds the glass together. The resin is the glue. Without it, you just have a pile of loose glass threads. On the outside of the hull is a layer called gel coat. This is a pigmented resin that's supposed to seal the boat and keep water out. The industry told you this gel coat is waterproof. That's the first lie. Water molecules are incredibly small. They can slip through the molecular structure of cured resin like smoke through a screen door. It's slow, but it happens. This process is called diffusion. Over months and years, water vapor migrates through the gel coat and gets trapped inside the laminate, the layers of glass and resin that make up the hull. Now here's where it gets bad. When the boat was built, the workers mixed resin with glass fibers by hand or with rollers. No matter how careful they were, they trapped tiny air bubbles in the laminate. These voids are everywhere in a fiberglass hull, even though you can't see them. When water vapor reaches these voids, it condenses into liquid water. Now you have a tiny pocket of water trapped inside your hull. But it's not just water. These voids also contain chemicals left over from the manufacturing process, unreacted resin, leftover catalyst, and binders used to hold the glass mat together. When water touches these chemicals, they dissolve. Now you have a concentrated chemical soup inside that void, and this is where the nightmare called osmosis begins. You might remember this from high school science. When you have a concentrated solution on one side of a semi-permeable membrane and pure water on the other side, water moves toward the concentrated side to try to balance things out. In your boat hull, the concentrated chemical soup is inside the void. The seawater outside is much less concentrated, so more water is pulled through the gel coat into the void. The pressure builds and builds. This osmotic pressure can reach 50 to 100 pounds per square inch. That's enough to physically rip the gel coat away from the laminate underneath. The result is what you see on older fiberglass boats. blisters. Hundreds of them, sometimes thousands. Pop one of these blisters open and you'll find a brown acidic liquid. It smells like vinegar. That's because it is vinegar, acetic acid. The resin is breaking down. This process is called hydrolysis. Remember that polyester resin is an ester, a chemical compound formed when an acid reacts with an alcohol. The problem is this reaction can run backward. When water gets into the resin, it breaks the ester bonds. The resin turns back into acid and alcohol. And the worst part, the acid speeds up the process. The more the resin breaks down, the more acid is created. The more acid, the faster the breakdown. It feeds on itself. The industry calls this boat pox. They make it sound cosmetic. That's the second lie. Osmotic blistering isn't just a surface problem, it's structural failure. As the resin hydrolyzes, it loses its grip on the glass fibers. The glass and resin start to separate. The hull loses stiffness. Research shows that fiberglass laminates immersed in water lose up to 50% of their stiffness over 20 years. Your hull starts to flex when it shouldn't. This creates stress cracks at the joints where the hull meets the deck, around the keel and at bulkheads. A boat that was rigid and safe when new becomes soft and dangerous. The indestructible hull is quietly dissolving in the water it was designed to float on. And there's no real fix. You can grind off the blisters, dry out the laminate, and reseal it with epoxy. But that costs $10,000 to $30,000 for a 30-foot boat. And it's only a temporary patch. The water will find a way back in. The chemistry doesn't change. Here's the economic reality. Right now, there are an estimated 35 to 40 million fiberglass boats worldwide that are reaching the end of their life. In the United States alone, thousands are abandoned every year. Hurricanes generate entire fleets of derelict boats in a single week. Why aren't they being recycled? Because fiberglass is a thermoset plastic. Once it's cured, you can't melt it down and reuse it. You'd have to grind it into powder or burn it in a high-temperature oven. Both processes cost more than the recovered material is worth. So these boats end up in landfills or worse, dumped in rivers and harbours. And as the resin continues to break down, it sheds microplastics and glass fibres into the water. It leaches chemicals, phthalates, styrene, and heavy metals from anti-fouling paint into the soil and marine ecosystem. The maintenance-free promise created the disposal impossible waste crisis. Viking ships didn't have this problem. When a longship reached the end of its useful life, it was burned or buried. The wood returned to the earth. The iron rivets oxidized to rust. There was no toxic legacy. The ship participated in the natural carbon cycle instead of disrupting it. So how did Viking builders create ships that lasted 50 years in service, then survived 1,100 years in the ground? The secret starts in the forest, decades before the ship is built. Viking shipwrights didn't just cut down any tree, they selected specific oaks that had grown slowly in cold climates. These trees produced wood that was incredibly dense and straight-grained. But here's the critical difference between their method and ours. They didn't saw the logs, they split them. Modern lumber is produced by sawing. You take a round log and slice it into flat boards using a saw blade. This is fast and efficient. You can get a lot of boards from one log. But sawing has a fatal flaw. It cuts across the wood fibers. Inside an oak tree, water and nutrients flow through microscopic tubes called vessels. These run vertically up and down the trunk. When you saw the log, the blade cuts through these vessels at random angles, exposing their open ends on the face of the board. Now you have thousands of tiny straws sticking out of the wood. These act as capillaries, actively wicking water deep into the plank. This is why sawn lumber rots so easily. You've created highways for water, bacteria, and fungal spores to penetrate the wood. Viking shipwrights used a completely different method, radial splitting. They drove wedges into the log and split it from the center to the bark, following the natural grain of the wood. This technique ensures the split follows the wood fibers instead of cutting across them. The result? A plank where all the vessels run parallel to the surface. They're intact and sealed. Water can't penetrate because the wood's internal plumbing is still connected. The plank is naturally water resistant by design. This also makes the wood mechanically stronger. In a split plank, the cellulose fiber, the source of wood's strength, run continuously from end to end. None are cut. This gives the timber exceptional flexibility. Viking ships were designed to be flexible. The hull would twist and bend as it rode over waves. Reconstructions of Viking ships using split planks can flex in ways that would snap modern sawn lumber. But splitting has a quality control requirement. If a tree has spiral grain, where the fibers twist around the trunk, the split will follow that twist. You'll get a warped board that's useless for a ship's hull. So Viking builders had to carefully select only the straightest trees. This acted as a natural filter, ensuring only the highest quality timber made it into the ship. Modern sawmills can force straight boards out of twisted logs, but the resulting lumber has short grain, weak spots where fibers were cut that cause it to fail under stress. Now let's talk about the second material advantage, pine tar. Pine tar is made by slowly burning pine wood in an oxygen-poor environment, usually a pit in the ground covered with turf. The heat drives the resin out of the wood and it drips down and collects at the bottom. But this tar is not paint. It's a preservative that soaks into the wood at a cellular level. The chemistry is remarkable. Pine tar contains 3 types of compounds that work together. Resin acids make up 50 to 60% of the tar. These are hydrophobic, so they repel water. When you apply tar to wood, these acids penetrate deep into the wood pores. Over time, they oxidize and polymerize, forming a flexible barrier that blocks water from entering. Phenolic compounds are natural biocides. Phenols kill fungi and bacteria by disrupting their cell walls. This protects the wood from dry rot and soft rot, the fungal infections that destroy untreated timber. Terpenes act as a solvent carrier. They make the tar thin enough to penetrate deeply. Once the tar is absorbed, the terpenes evaporate, leaving the protective resin acids and phenols behind. Here's the critical difference between pine tar and modern paint. If water does get into the wood, through a crack or a fastener hole, the tar allows that moisture to evaporate back out. When the sun heats the wood, water vapor is pulled through the tar layer and released. Modern polyurethane paint, by contrast, traps moisture inside. If water gets under the paint film, it can't escape. This creates a greenhouse effect that accelerates rot. The paint that was supposed to protect the wood ends up killing it. Viking shipwrights applied tar regularly, sometimes twice a year. They weren't sealing the wood. They were feeding it with a breathable preservative that worked with the wood's natural ability to absorb and release moisture. There's one more detail that shows how sophisticated this system was. For pine components, masts, decking and spars, Viking builders used a technique to pre-treat the living tree. They would strip the bark years before felling. This traumatized the tree and triggered its natural defense, flooding the heartwood with resin. Over several growing seasons, the tree would pump so much resin into its core that the wood became naturally rot-resistant from the inside out. When they finally cut the tree down, the timber was already impregnated with nature's preservative. This is the same idea modern pressure-treated lumber tries to copy, but the Vikings did it by manipulating the living biology of the tree, not by injecting toxic chemicals. The final piece of the system was the construction method itself. Viking ships used clinker or lapstrake construction. The planks overlap like shingles on a roof and are riveted together. This creates a flexible shell. But here's the genius. The internal ribs weren't bolted rigidly to the planks. They were lashed to cleats carved out of the planking. This meant the hull could flex independently of the frame. When the ship hit a wave, the energy was absorbed by the flexible lashing joints instead of transmitted as a shock through rigid bolts. Modern boats, whether wood or fiberglass, use rigid frames bolted to rigid hulls. When they hit a wave, the energy has nowhere to go. It creates stress concentrations that lead to cracks and fatigue failures. The Viking ship swam over the water. It bent and twisted. This flexibility prevented the catastrophic stress failures that plague rigid modern hulls. The Oseberg wasn't just preserved by the clay it was buried in. It lasted 50 years in active service first, in saltwater, storms and brutal North Atlantic conditions, using only split oak, pine tar and clever engineering. That's not luck. That's superior material science. So if the Viking system was superior in so many ways, why did we abandon it? 3 reasons: speed, cost, and cheap energy. After World War II, there was a massive housing and consumer goods boom. The petrochemical industry had developed advanced plastics and resins for military use, airplane canopies, radar domes, and lightweight armor. When the war ended, these companies needed peacetime markets. Fiberglass boats were the perfect application. Ray Green, working with Owens Corning, realized he could mold a boat hull in hours instead of the months required to plank and caulk a wooden boat. The labor savings were enormous. Winner Manufacturing proved you could mass-produce boats on an assembly line. Pop the hull out of a mold, install the deck, add an engine and ship it. A village shipwright building traditional wooden boats couldn't compete. The industry also benefited from cheap oil. Polyester resin is a petroleum product. In the 1950s and 60s, oil was incredibly cheap. The cost of materials was low, so manufacturers could undercut wooden boat builders on price. And there was a cultural shift. The post-war generation wanted convenience. They'd lived through rationing and scarcity. Now they wanted the easy life. A fiberglass boat that required no maintenance fit perfectly into this vision. The problem is, maintenance-free was always a lie. Wooden boats required visible maintenance. You could see when the paint was fading. You could see cracks in the caulking. You knew you had to sand and repaint every year. Fiberglass boats require invisible maintenance. The problems are happening inside the laminate where you can't see them until it's too late. But the industry sold the maintenance-free dream so successfully that owners actually neglected their boats. They assumed no visible problems meant no problems at all. This created a feedback loop. Boats degraded silently for 15 to 20 years. Then catastrophic blistering appeared. Owners were shocked. They'd been told this couldn't happen. The industry response was to blame the owner. You didn't wash the boat enough. You left it in the water too long. You should have waxed the gel coat. None of that changes the chemistry. Hydrolysis is inevitable. Osmosis is physics. There's also an economic incentive that's rarely discussed. The fiberglass boat industry thrives on replacement sales. A well-maintained wooden boat can last 50 to 100 years. Some are still sailing after 150 years. A fiberglass boat marketed correctly creates a 30 to 40-year replacement cycle. That's much better for manufacturers' bottom lines. The final piece is the loss of traditional knowledge. After World War II, trade schools stopped teaching traditional shipbuilding. The skills of selecting timber, splitting planks and applying tar were considered obsolete. The last generation of shipwrights who knew these methods is dying out. We're witnessing the extinction of knowledge that took thousands of years to develop. The modern approach violates a basic principle. We should design for the entire life cycle of a product, including its death. The fiberglass industry designed for the sale. They ignored what happens 40 years later. Now we're all paying for that short-sightedness. So what can you actually do with this knowledge? If you're buying a boat, understand that fiberglass is not maintenance-free. It requires care. Here's what to look for and how to extend its life. Step 1. Inspect for osmosis before buying. Get a moisture meter reading of the hull. This device measures the moisture content in the laminate. A dry hull should read below 10%. Anything above 15% means water has penetrated the laminate. Above 20% indicates serious osmosis. If you're looking at a used boat, check the bottom of the hull for blisters. Small blisters, pinhead size, can be managed. Large blisters or soft spots mean the laminate is compromised. Walk away from heavily blistered boats unless you're prepared to spend $10,000 to $30,000 on a full blister repair and barrier coating. Step 2. Keep the gel coat sealed. The gel coat is your first line of defense. UV light from the sun breaks down the resin over time, creating micro cracks. These cracks allow water to penetrate faster. Wax the hull at least twice a year. This fills the micro cracks and provides UV protection. Use a marine-grade carnauba wax, not car wax. If the gel coat is heavily oxidized, chalky and dull, you'll need to compound and polish it before waxing. This removes the degraded surface layer. Step 3. Minimize water exposure. This sounds obvious, but it matters. If you can trailer your boat and store it on land between uses, do it. Every hour out of the water reduces the time water has to diffuse through the gel coat. If you must keep the boat in the water, haul it out at least once a year. Let the hull dry completely for several weeks. This allows absorbed moisture to evaporate before it causes damage. Step 4. Apply a barrier coat to older boats. If your boat is 20+ years old and showing early signs of osmosis, consider applying an epoxy barrier coat. This is a thick layer of epoxy paint applied over the gel coat to slow water penetration. This won't stop osmosis entirely. Epoxy is also semi-permeable, but it can buy you another 10 to 15 years. The process requires grinding the gel coat to remove oxidation, drying the hull completely, then applying 6 to 10 coats of epoxy barrier paint. Expect to pay $3,000 to $8,000 for a professional job on a 30-foot boat. Step 5. Accept that fiberglass has a lifespan. This is the hardest pill to swallow. Your fiberglass boat will eventually fail. The chemistry is working against you. Budget for eventual replacement or major refurbishment. Don't assume the boat will last forever just because it looks fine today. But what about wooden boats? If you're willing to invest the time, a properly built and maintained wooden boat can outlast any fiberglass vessel. But modern wooden boats are expensive. A custom-built wooden sailboat can cost 2 to 3 times what a comparable fiberglass boat costs. This is because the labor is intensive and the skills are rare. If you have the skills to maintain it, buying a vintage wooden boat can be economical, but you need to commit to the maintenance schedule, annual sanding and painting, regular inspections for rot, and recorking seams as needed. The trade-off is longevity and repairability. A wooden boat can be completely rebuilt. A fiberglass boat with severe osmosis cannot. But this isn't just about boats. It's about how we think about materials and maintenance. The maintenance-free promise is a seductive lie. Nothing is maintenance-free. Everything requires stewardship. The Vikings understood this. They built ships that demanded attention, tarring, caulking, and inspections. But in return, those ships could be repaired indefinitely. We built boats that promised to take care of themselves. But when they fail, they fail completely. And we've created an environmental disaster in the process. True durability comes from designing systems that can be maintained, repaired, and eventually returned to the Earth. If you found this valuable, hit that like button and subscribe. We're digging up the knowledge that modern industry buried. Knowledge about materials, durability, and what actually works over centuries, not just decades. Drop a comment and tell us, have you dealt with osmotic blistering on a fiberglass boat? What did it cost to repair? Or are you considering buying a wooden boat after watching this? The Viking shipwright with his axe and tar wasn't primitive. He was a materials engineer who understood chemistry through observation and iteration. He knew that true permanence comes from working with nature, not against it. We traded that wisdom for speed and convenience. Now we're drowning in fiberglass hulls that can't be recycled and boats that are falling apart after 30 years. The knowledge isn't lost. It's just waiting for us to rediscover it. Every time you choose repairability over disposability, every time you maintain instead of replace, you're bringing that Viking wisdom back. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up what they buried.